Perfect. We just wait another 4 minutes if anyone wants to join, because this session it doesn't have a lot of presentation slide. It's more on hands-on, and it's more on showing you the portal, the configuration, and how to connect to the Azure SQL DB, and how to configure the replica and the failover clustering there. We just wait another 4 minutes in case anyone else want to join so they can see it from the beginning. Thank you, guys. Perfect. Thank you guys for waiting. So right now it's about 7:05 p.m. 24th May. Yeah, today we have amazing content about the Azure SQL Database Zero to Hero administration. So today we are going to learn about the Azure SQL DB. Before we proceed, I would like to check, are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
You guys may raise the hand. Are you guys able to see my screen as well?
Yeah.
That's perfect. And I appreciate everyone to keep mute, and the session is already in the recording mode, and later on I'm gonna share the link with you guys. Thanks a lot. This is Hamid J. Firth. I'm the Technical Sales Director in Firth Solutions. Um, I'm the MCM holder, MCSM holder, CIW database design MVP as well. My experience is mostly on the Azure SQL database, Azure SQL Pool, Azure Synapse, Power BI as well. So let's talk about the Azure relational databases. I'm sure you guys heard about the Azure. Azure is a cloud solution which developed by Microsoft and is in the market, I think, about more than 10 years. Yeah. So initially, when I heard about the Azure, they actually came out with the Windows Azure. And that time it was back in 2008 or 2009, and they say that, wow, this is the new OS. So that time I thought that it's a new OS, but later on I realized, no, that's not the OS. That's the fabric. That's the platform to run the cloud solutions. So Microsoft named it as Azure. Azure has a lot of different services, but initially it released the Azure SQL. Azure SQL is the SQL Server, but it's at a platform as a service, which means that they provide the database engine, they provide the infrastructure, they provide those security um, features and so on. They just ask us to host our database and they charge us based on the resource consumption in our workload. Then later on, they add on different different databases like MySQL, like PostgreSQL. Then after that, they say that, okay, why not we limit it to, why not we move to the NoSQL like Cosmos DB and so on. But today we are only focusing on the Azure SQL DB. So in the Azure SQL itself, we have few different products. Azure SQL, as I said, is a platform as a service, but it has different products. Like initially, as I said, it released the Azure SQL DB, is a fully managed platform. Microsoft manage everything from the storage, from the patching, backups, and so on. And we just need to monitor the workload, and we just need to make sure that the configuration and the compute power that we assign is sufficient. Then later on, Microsoft released another SQL. They call it Azure SQL DW. It was a kind of service for the data warehousing for a huge amount of workload, but mostly on the analytics. Then after that, they rename it and they put it as an Azure SQL Pool. They renamed this product after they release Azure Synapse. So once they release the Azure Synapse for the analytics, for the ETL processing tools and so on, then they changed this Azure SQL DW to Azure SQL Pool, which is the same thing, just the name is changed. But recently, I can say recently is in the last 2 years, they add on another product called, and the service is the Azure SQL Managed Instance. Why they release Azure SQL Managed Instance? Because a lot of databases, when we try to migrate to Azure SQL DB, it wasn't compatible. Like for example, Azure SQL DB doesn't have agent services. Just imagine that your database has a lot of jobs, agent jobs, and you guys need to run it. You need to schedule it. Some of it is related to the analytics, some of it related to the maintenance of the DB, some for transferring the data here and there. But Azure SQL DB doesn't support that. Then Microsoft realized that, oops, that's you know, the point that a lot of clients, they might not use the Azure SQL. Then they released the Azure SQL Managed Instance. So when we talk about the Azure SQL Managed Instance, Microsoft provides you the entire instance, which is including the agent and the database engine. For provisioning the SQL MI, Azure SQL MI, it takes about 6 hours, but for provisioning the Azure SQL DB, it only takes few minutes, less than 5 or 10 minutes. For provisioning the Azure SQL pool, also it takes about 2 to 3 hours to provision the resources. So what's the difference between all of this? As I said, SQL DB is for the small to medium workload. If you don't need the agent services, that's the perfect. And you don't need cross database reference, which means from the database A, you are not going to query against the database B. In some scenarios, some environment, they still practice that, especially the database servers that they host multiple databases from different solutions, from different applications, and they try to do the data integration between these databases. So they try to do the cross database reference and querying. So Azure SQL DB doesn't support that. Um, Azure SQL Managed Instance, it supports all of it is similar to your on-premise database instance, except the storage and the VM and the resources are managed by Microsoft, maintained by Microsoft. The only thing that you need to do is the security hardening, managing the instance, configuring the instance, and so on. Another one's the Azure SQL Pool, which is similar to Azure SQL DB. But the difference is it has more functionalities in terms of distributing the table in multiple heaps. Actually, the Azure SQL Pool is similar to the SQL Server parallel data warehouse solution, which means that we can duplicate our tables, indexes distributed into multiple disks and multiple files for, running the query faster. And in the Azure SQL Pool, you are able to run into multiple slave nodes. When we talk about the slave nodes, because SQL Pool has master node and the slave node. By default, it only runs in the one master node and the one slave node. Then if you need more processing power, more resources, then you can expand the instance of the slave node, then it can run faster. Again, when it comes to Azure SQL DB, it requires two different models for the provisioning. I mean, either one of it you are able to choose and run your Azure SQL DB. The basic is the DTU. The DTU is based on the transaction unit, based on the IO, CPU utilization, memory, and the network utilization. So Microsoft come out with some numbers, maybe 100, 200, 300, and so on. DTU is very suitable for those solutions that the workload is small to medium. It doesn't require a lot of CPU resources. How we determine whether our query requires CPU resources? If you don't put a lot of cast convert, if you don't use a lot of date add, date diff, if you don't use a lot of arithmetic operators in your query, it doesn't really require a lot of CPU resources. So the DTU is good enough. But when it comes to the DTU, we have two subset, which is single database and another one's the elastic pool. Sometimes you want to isolate your database workload and the resources, and you don't want to share with any other database workload, which means that you want to allocate 200 DTU only for your HR application database. And no matter what, even during Saturday, Sunday that nobody used the HR application, you just want to reserve that and you don't want to share between sales or ERP application database resources. So you don't want that. You just want to make it isolated, dedicated. That is the single database DTU. Another one is, which is the cost effective, and it can, provision, not provision, it can utilize the DTU resources among all these databases that you have, is the elastic pool. So when we talk about the elastic pool, we allocate the specific number of DTU for a pool, then we assign all our databases to that pool, and databases will utilize the DTU based on their workload. If their workload increase, they consume more DTU. If their workload decrease, they consume less DTU, and they are able to share the balance with other databases and the workloads. This is quite good if you have one database that it doesn't have much workload and the other one is having a lot of workload, but the first DB maybe during the month end or mid of the month or during for specific workload, it requires more DTU, and you are able to tolerate that the second database performance drop temporarily. You can use the elastic pool, and also, as I said, is the cost efficient. Another one is the vCore. vCore is a new generation of the resource provisioning in the Azure SQL DB. At the beginning, it wasn't exist. It was only DTU for single DB. Then Microsoft introduced Elastic Pool. Then they say, wow, you can save a lot of money, and everyone were happy that time. Then Microsoft say that, oh, you need more resources, more compute power, more memory, because I tell you the DTU and the single DB and the Elastic Pool is memory limited environment. It only provides you 2 GB to 8 GB memory per database. But when you need more memory and the CPU, then you need to switch to the vCore. When we talk about the vCore, we have two types of vCores. One is the provisioned. Provision means that you are saying that, dear Azure, please reserve that vCores for me and the amount of memory, no matter whether I'm using it or I'm not using it. That's it. And I'm gonna pay you sincerely. So Microsoft is going to charge you on every hour that you allocate the vCore. So the vCore provision, it has minimum and the maximum. So maximum vCores and the minimum vCores as well. You can set it. And per vCore and the generation you are choosing, then it will allocate more memory. So the standard vCore generation, it can allocate, if I don't mistaken, 5.1 GB per vCore. So if you allocate 2 vCores, then it will give you 10.2 GB of memory. If you need more memory, then you need to add on more vCores. And the cost, I can tell you, is 10 to 20 times more than DTU. And if you misconfigure the vCore, the cost can shoot up a lot. It can go for single DB 4 to 5K USD in a month. So we need to really careful about that. Another one which they introduce is a serverless. Microsoft say, okay, you want vCore, I can give you serverless. You might not have workload on every hour or every moment. So during the midnight, the serverless vCore, it can, get off and share the resources to another tenant. So that's the serverless. But the problem with the serverless is, if Azure decide to shut down your SQL DB in the serverless environment because there's no workload, after 1 hour, Azure will say, okay, release the resources to other tenants, other database workloads, while there's no workload for you. If the new workload comes in, they will hit the timeout error. The application will hit timeout error. Then it needs to try again after a few minutes. Because when it hit the timeout error, when the workload comes into the Azure environment, then the Azure will say, oh, that resources were deallocated and it pushed to another workload and the tenant. Oh, you need the resources? Why not? Just wait, just hold on. I'm gonna allocate vCore and the memory for you. So it takes some times for the database to come up and respond to your application. Don't scared if, let's say, your provision serverless early in the morning, the the staff and the users, they complain and they say, oh, we tried to log in, but it hit the timeout. It doesn't log in, but after a while, after maybe 5-10 minutes, then start working. That's okay. And when it, let's say, is a kind of mystery for you, that's the reason, because the resource is deallocated and try to allocate. That's all about the theory and the necessary info that I need to provide you. Let's get into the demonstration, and I'm gonna provision. I'm gonna connect through the SSMS. We are going to do the security hardening, set up the defender. We are going to set up database replication into different region. We are going to set up database auditing at the server and DB level, review the problematic queries, and apply recommendation indexes through the Azure portal. We are going to set up the database backup, and also we are going to set up the failover group for higher availability. All of these actually will be done through the Azure portal. We are not going to do any coding in this session. So if you are new to the Azure SQL environment, don't worry. We don't do any coding in this session. Do you guys have any question before I proceed? If you have, unmute yourself. Please ask your question. We have chat here. Okay, so seems that there's no question, then let's proceed. Once you guys log into the portal.azure.com, you need to use your own login and you need to purchase the subscription. It appears like this, but again, you guys will never have these resources because this is our existing environment. To create the resources in Azure, we have here, you can see that all those hot resources actually listed here. But if you want more resources and services, then you can click here, all services. Then you can see all the services that Azure provides. It can be from the AI, data, hosting, storage, SQL DBs, relational DBs, NoSQL, big data, and many, many things. Like you can see the compute, you can see the containers, databases. It supports many different databases. DevOps and so on. Again, it will be different topics for each of these services and the products. Again, we are going to focus on Azure SQL databases. So right now I want to create the new databases. I have already for our own products, but I'm going to create new database servers. So when you click on the SQL databases and we click on here, create, it asks us, first, we need to mention what subscription we are going to use. So for this case, I'm just going to choose this Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. Then the second thing it asks is the resource group. I just want to inform you that in Azure environment, we have a kind of logical container. When I say that logical container is a group name, is a name, is a group that is logically we set, but physically is not there, it's not exist. It's something like file group in SQL Server, which is logically exist, but physically it doesn't exist. Unlike files. This is to organize your resources. If let's say you have a project like HR or sales, or for example, ERP project, it's good that you keep all the related resources into the single resource group. So I'm going to create new resource group. I'm going to put here like Azure SQL event, because later on when I want to remove the resources, it's easier for me. So I don't miss anything. So Azure SQL event, and I'm gonna create the database name. This is the database name. I want to put here sales DB. Okay, the DBs exist. The next is I want to create the server. If I click here, I have servers here, but I don't want to use these servers because these are belongs to different project. Then I need to create new server. So in this new server, it will ask me what is your server name because I'm gonna use it through the DNS, the FQDN. FQDN is the fully qualified domain name. So I'm gonna put the Azure SQL DB event. Let's check. Yeah, it's available. That's good. And the next is the location where I'm gonna locate this DB. So right now we are in Canada. So I'm gonna choose North Central. No, it's US. We need to look for Canada Central. And here is going to ask me for authentication. Am I going to only use the Azure AD, or I'm going to use both, or I'm going to only use the Azure SQL authentication? So Azure AD is something like Windows authentication, but for the Azure SQL DB, the user that requires to connect to the database, it needs to have the Azure AD account. Currently, most of the applications that, let's say you guys install application on-premise, or you have it hosted in different server, and you need to connect to the Azure SQL DB, most probably it doesn't have Azure AD. So what you can do, the best is to choose both SQL and Azure AD. So when we click on this, both SQL and Azure AD, we are able to connect in through Azure AD and also the native SQL login. Now I need to choose my admin. I'm trying to choose, okay, my own account. Oh, it says that the member is not allowed. Oh yeah, for this subscription, I don't have AD. Then I only have no choice to use the SQL authentication, which is a native authentication. I want to put some name for the login because it doesn't use the SA login anymore. So we need to rename it Azure SQL event, for example, and we key in the password. Okay. And we need to try to use very strong password. Then we click OK. So we already create the server here. And now it asks us, do you want to use the elastic pool? Elastic pool, you don't need to really answer right now. If you want to do it later on, you can create. It's not an issue. So at the moment, I don't want to create elastic pool. The workload environment, is it development or production? I just set it production, for example. If you are going for using the development, then you just click on development. Okay. You can see the charges are far different. You see like 22, this is subscription is in Southeast Asia. So 22 Malaysian ringgit is about $5, 5 USD. But when it comes to the production, it's different story. It become $200+ per month. So let's say we go for production, we go for networking. The next thing that is required to configure is the networking. First section, it's ask you whether you want to connect through public endpoint or private endpoint, or you don't want to have access at all. Basically, if you don't want to have access at all, then there's no point to create the SQL DB. If you want to connect it through internet, means that you have on-premise application server and you need to connect through internet to the Azure SQL DB, then you need to choose public endpoint. If no, your application is hosted on the Azure in the same subscription, then you don't want to expose the database server and the database through the internet, then you just click on the private endpoint. So you can see when you choose different options, the next configuration, it will be different. So public endpoint, it goes to the firewall rules. Private endpoint, it goes to the virtual network and the subnet that you want to grant for the access. We go for public endpoint because I want to connect through the SSMS. The next is, it says that would you like to allow Azure services to access to this resource? If you have some virtual machine or some application that hosted in Azure, at the same time, you would like to expose your database through the public IP and through the internet. And if you want your Azure hosted application is connect through the Azure network, not through the internet, through the internal network, then you need to set it yes. If you don't want that, then you need to set no, which means no means your application hosted on Azure still need to go through internet and connect back to the database server. If you click yes, then it will goes internally. It doesn't go through the internet and connect back to the DB. Right now we don't have it, so it's no point. I mean, either one is okay. It depends whether we have the application. Then it asks us, do you want to add your current public IP for the client? If I click yes, it will add on my router's public IP. And if let's say I restart the router, then the public IP will be different. Then I might not able to connect to the DB. And it will stop me from the connecting. Then I need to go through the portal, then I check my public IP, then I add it, then I'm able to connect. So this is the thing you need to remember as well. If your office is using the dynamic public IP, then if you click yes, then after a month, you guys restart the router or anything happened to the ISP that sometimes they exchange the IP addresses, then you might not able to access to the DB and you might face the timeout error. It's not able to connect to the SQL. Then once you connect to the Azure portal, then you need to check whether your IP is granted and whether it's the same IP. Please take note on that. I have seen a lot of people get panic and they don't know why it happens, but that's the reason. If your office is having static public IP, which means that even though you restart the router in your office, the public IP doesn't change, then that's okay. Once you set it here, then everything is fine. Another one is the connection policy. Connection policy is related to the communication between your client application, clients, and the SQL DB. If we use the default, then the Azure will redirect all the connections through the Azure through the public IP, except for the private endpoint. If we click on the proxy, then all the connections, it needs to go through the proxy and the gateway. And another one's the redirect. Redirect, it will redirect to different node and the hosting of the database. If you are going to use for the small medium database server, if let's say you don't mind to have the same port like 1433, that's the default port, then you just use a default. But if your concern is, oh, I don't want anyone to be able to access my Azure SQL DB through 1433 TCP port, then I suggest you to use the proxy. Then you need to have application gateway, the Azure SQL Database gateway. Then you configure the backends, then you configure the routes and so on. But actually, we are not going to show through this session. So we just go through this default, then we are able to connect. Then another one is the encrypted connections, which I suggest you choose the TLS 1.2. That's the minimum. But sometimes the applications, they are not compatible. Some applications, they hard code the TLS version that they want to use. Then it hit the error. And the error message is like, it's able to connect to the server, it shake the hand, but the connection forcibly closed by the server. So that's the error message. So if you see that kind of error message in your application and the database environment, most probably is the TLS version conflict. The next is the security, um, which we are going to enable the Microsoft Defender. Here it says that trial and the cost is about $12 per month, as here. We just need to divide it by 4.5. Then it will be $12 a month. You are able to enable it later on. Another one is the ledger. Ledger is to detect any tampering or data changes, anything that uh, within your database. It uses the cryptography technology to make sure that your data is not suddenly tampered or changed by someone, and it try to validate whether its data is valid or not. Another is the server identity, is the user system assigned for the managed identities. We are able to configure that, the access management between the database server and the users and the Azure AD. And the next is the TDE. TDE is the transparent data encryption, which if you would like to encrypt your database in the Azure, you can have it at two levels, server level and the database level. If you choose the server level, you need to choose the managed key. Either is the Azure managed key, or you want to create your own certificate for the encryption. Bring your own certificate. Then the second level, if you want to have it, you can have it at the DB level only, which means within this server, you can have multiple databases, but you decide to only encrypt one database. Then you need to use the DB level. If you decide to encrypt all the databases, then you need to use the server level, which we are able to encrypt later on. So I actually keep all of this by default value. Then later on, we are going to enable it. Then the next, it says that would you like to restore the backup, or you would like to have a sample database, which is AdventureWorks. When you click on the backup, it asks you what storage and what backup you would like to restore. So I don't want to restore any backup. And here, the last and the most important is the collation. You need to ensure that the collation you choose here is compatible with your application and the database that you are going to, let's say, restore in the Azure SQL DB. If the collation has some conflict, queries might not work properly. Some queries might work, some not, especially during in the workloads. Let's say you are comparing two character um, columns, two columns that they have character data type, or you are going to sort by character data type. That might be troublesome, and some workload might not work as per expected. And here we have a system default 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. maintenance window, which means that if Microsoft requires to do some patching, then they do it during this time. But I just want to inform you that for the Azure SQL DB, the patching, they call it hot patching, which means that they exchange the DLL while the SQL DB is up and running. So it doesn't really impact your workload and the operation hours. Next is a tag. Then you are able to tag your Azure SQL resource. Let's say I can say that name of the project value Azure SQL event. And I want to choose for these resources. Then next, review and create. So it says that the price is about 210 USD per month. This is our what I call the resource group name, where we are going to store the DB. What's the DB name? This is the empty blank DB. This is the server name, Azure SQL DB event dot database dot windows.net. Then it's a SQL authentication. That's the SQL admin. Here is the compute and the storage. It put the vCore. Let's go back. This will be costly. Let's go back. Previous. Here we missed out. So you see, when you missed out, it's extra charges. But anyhow, we are able to exchange it, and we are able to change the configuration once we deploy. Here it says that is a standard series G5 Gen 5 is 2 vCore, 32 GB of storage, not the memory. When you click on configure database server, we have here the tiers. We have the vCore tier, DTU tier. Basically, I love DTU because I can manage the workload, and I'm able to manage the price as well. You know, when it comes to the cloud computing, is the OPEX, is not the CAPEX. When it comes to the OPEX, head of departments, finance department, they always ask, why are we spending this much of money? And they don't want to have surprise, especially finance department. They don't want to have surprise in terms of the figures. They don't want to see this month is $1,000, then the next month suddenly become $2,000, because they don't budget for that. And you know, it ruins all their calculations and the forecasting. So that's why I like DTU. So when the DTU hits application, basically it fell for the workload, then we know whether we need to tune the workload or we need to increase the DTU. To increase the DTU, then we can talk to the finance department. We say that, hey, if I need to increase it and I need budget for it, then they can allocate. So there's no surprise. But the vCore, basically, it can go with surprises. Here we have DTU basic, maximum 2 GB, 5 basic DTU, and the cost is $5. If I choose standard, which they put it budget friendly, then I can go from 10 DTU to 3000 DTU. 3000 DTU, I can tell you, just based on my experience, the rule of thumb is, if you want to choose what DTU is needed, you need to go for number of concurrent users, okay? And also you need to go for the workload itself, like how much CPU that been utilized by the workload. And also you divide it by 3 and you take 2/3 of it, which means with this 3000 DTU, honestly, I can host a database server that it can, you know, accept workload between 1500 to 2000 queries per hour. It's a lot of workload. So we can do that. And if, let's say, you are the workload and the queries using less CPU in intensive functions like date add, date part, date name, convert, cast, these kind of functions, actually they are performance killer. And also you have proper indexes on your table, then you don't need to allocate a lot of DTU. So in our production environment for one of our system, which is, it has a lot of connections and the active sessions. We only have 200 DTU. So 200 DTU was sufficient for us. It's about 100 concurrent sessions, 100 to 220 concurrent sessions. Then you increase the DTU, then you are able to increase the storage. Like for example, DTU 200 maximum storage is 1 TB. If you need more storage, then you increase the DTU. Oh, sorry. The standard maximum is 1 TB. If you want, then you need to increase to premium. Then premium is able to increase to 4 TB per database. I just want to inform you, when we talk about the data max size, that is the data file. If you look at the data file, the data itself, because SQL Server has two files. One is the data file, one is the transaction log file. In the Azure SQL DB, you are not worried about the transaction log file grow. So Azure SQL DB manage that log file. So what we are setting here is only for the data file. When we click on the premium is for highest availability and performance, then here we are able to do like rate scale out. If you would like to have more performance and more resources for select query, then you are able to enable this. And if you want to have zone redundancy, then you are able to click yes here. Why it comes with the zone redundancy in the premium, but it doesn't come with the standard? Because standard doesn't duplicate your database into different server rack in the data center. But in the premium, it does. Okay, so if you want to have zone redundancy, you just click yes without any extra charges, which already charged here. You can see that it doesn't change at all. And it will copy into another server rack for you. Recently, when I say that recently, it was about 3 months ago, if I don't mistaken, one of our client database went offline in Azure. Then they asked us to check. When we check, we realized that the Azure data center in Singapore, one of the zone that unfortunately it was hosting our client database, it went down. The server was shut down with the intention of not damaging the storage and the compute powers. And what was the root cause? That one of the data center fan for that zone was broken, and it took them 48 hours to replace the fan. So basically, because that client, they used the standard tier here, so they didn't have that redundancy. Then I advised them, but they say that the cost is too high and it happens once in a while. So for them, they tolerate with the downtime. But I just want to tell you, if you are having what I call it, the mission critical environment, then it's better to use the premium. So you can see that we have a DTU, you can play with it, and the storage. Let's talk about the vCore. When we click on the vCore general purpose, we have provision serverless. You can see that when we click on provisioned, it only goes by vCore and the max of the database. If we go for serverless, it goes with minimum vCore and the maximum vCore. And also it comes out with the minimum memory and the maximum memory. If I increase to 10, it will give me 30 GB of maximum memory and 3.75 minimum memory. And the vCore minimum is 1.25. If let's say I increase the minimum vCore to 2, then 6 GB, 30 GB, and so on. And we are able to set here auto pause delay. So auto pause delay, as I said, it will, make it like pause, then it doesn't respond to the workload. The first workload comes in, it will be terminated. It will hit the timeout error. then Azure will bring up the resources, then it's able to connect. And here is the database size that we can set. So up to 2 TB here. This is serverless. The provision, it will allocate, and you can see the cost is fixed. Unlike serverless. Serverless, it goes by hour. It's not fixed. It says that vCore per second, this is the charges. But provision, it doesn't care. It says that this is your monthly payment. You need to pay me. You use it or you don't use it. It's up to you. You still need to pay me. So this is something that you need to, um, you know, take note on that. So when we increase, it doesn't count any memory. Then you can increase the storage as well. That is the general purpose. For the hyperscale and the business critical, the options will be different. So when we talk about the provision, we are able to have high availability secondary replica as well. How many replica would you like to have? Up to 4, which is the enterprise edition, can go up to 8. For here, it goes up to 4. And you can also go for the cores as well. Another one is the serverless. Again, is the same thing, maximum, minimum, and the availability as well. The other one is the business critical, which is the provision. It doesn't have serverless, and you need to allocate the vCores and the storage. So if, let's say, I just want to give you perhaps the indication, this one is costing about 5,000 USD, this configuration. Let me go back. Yep. So for 18 cores, 480, or just imagine 500 GB of database size, it can cost about 5,000 USD a month. When we look at it, for some companies might be reasonable, for some not. Anyhow, resource consumption in Azure is highly depends on your workload. If you are able to tune the queries, you are able to create the proper indexes, you can save a lot of money. Let's go to the standard, my favorite, and 100. We go for, let's say, 40 GB. Apply. Then let's review and create. Yep, the budget, the amount is okay. Now it's actually slashed into half. Then the rest of the config is same. Then we create the Azure SQL DB. Any questions while it's provisioning the resources? Oh, what is it actually doing? Right now it's provisioning the resources because it's creating the Azure SQL DB instance, is creating the database, is configuring the client IP, is actually allowing the Azure IPs, and also is creating the firewall rules for us, and at the same time allocating the public IP and the DNS name. So that's what it's doing right now. Okay, it's deployed. Just imagine how fast it creates the server, allocate the resources, and once we click on go to resource, then this is it. Let's check. Oh, most welcome. So this is the resource, and this is the DNS. So let's try to connect through the SSMS. Perfect. We just paste it here, and we go for Azure SQL DB event, and we key in the password. Okay, it says the login failed for that. Let me check. Um, what is the login? Here we have, sorry, Azure SQL event, not the DB. My bad. Azure SQL event. Okay, it's connected. As you see that it doesn't have the agent service. It's quite basic. It doesn't have management, all those things. It's just a DB. Even the system DB is only master. You cannot access to model, MSDB, and the temp DB. And this master is not shared between um, all the tenants. It's actually dedicated for your server. And here we have the sales DB, which is a blank DB here. If you want to create new DB, go ahead. You can just create from here, or you can create it through the portal. So today's everything is through the portal. I'm not gonna do any coding here. It's just for showing you that how we manage to connect. Now let's go through it one by one from the left panel. Then we see what is it here. Um, this is the pricing. This is the overview. It shows that the essential info that you want to know. I mostly look at the right hand side because it's very important here. Pricing tier, the DTU that we select, connection string that we might need to provide to the application developers. When you click here, you can see the connection string for different drivers. Let's say JDBC, ODBC, and ADO.NET. When you click on Elastic Pool, it goes to Elastic Pool part, which I'm gonna do that later on, but let us go through first. Then here's the server name. This is the DB. So if you look at here, it's the sales DB, SQL DB. And it shows here, this is our server, this is the DB. So if you click here, it goes to the server itself, which we are able to reset the password for our login. This is our admin. It goes for the network configuration. If we want to use a dedicated SQL pool, we are able to create, or we want to create new Elastic pool, we are able to create, or even create a new DB, we are able to do that. It's not an issue here. Let's go through the DB first. Then this is the DB. So for the DB, we are able to set the firewall individually. If you want to set the firewall and you want to allow specific IP addresses to connect, you click here, set the firewall. Then you are able to add your client IP, which already add, sorry, a firewall rule. Then I just say that Hello everyone, start IP, for example, and the end IP. So by this, I allow everyone to access anyone, through internet. Done. So every one of you can access to this server with the username and the password. This part is part of the networking under the server. So it's the firewall. Go back to the DB. And another thing that you might need it in future is the monitoring of the resources. Sometimes you might face like users, they say that, oh, we hit the timeout error, or we tried to update the record, but it didn't get updated. That's occasionally it happens. Maybe early in the morning happens, and during late afternoon, during the batch job processing or heavy workload. Then you need to come here and check what's going on in the last 1 hour, last 24 hours, last 7 days, and so on. This is the DTU. DTU, as I said, is the number of processor, memory, and the disk I/O and the network I/O that Azure allocates for your server. I want to do some, I want to shoot up the DTU. Just sorry, I still need to do some coding, but it's fine. Just let me create table dummy C1 big int C2 date time. Then we go for go. Then we insert into, sorry, let me make it as prop dummy create big int identity 11. Dummy values, sorry, C2 values date add minute minus 56, for example, sys UTC date time. Go perhaps 5 million maybe. Yep. Create. Okay. Now it's in a loop that is, sorry. Okay. Now it's in the loop that inserting a record. Let's look at the chart here. Let's refresh. You see that the DTU is going up 6%. Let's refresh again. So over the time, it will increase. We can go for average, we can go for mean, we can go for max. If you want to find a problem in the DTU, you need to click on max DTU. If you see most of it hit 100%, then you are having DTU shortage. You need to add on DTU resources. How to add on? You just come to the compute plus storage, and you are able to add on the DTU. Or if you see that it's too much and during the heavy workload, the DTU utilization is less than 40% or 50%, then you can decrease it. You can save cost. Let me apply. So what happened when you change the resources, the compute and the storage? No, but the compute, when you change it, it will disconnect all these sessions from the Azure SQL. Then it will increase the resources or decrease the resources. Then after that, it will allow the users to connect. So most probably we will hit the timeout or the the session is terminated error here, unless Microsoft improved the product recently. Because previously it always happened. Okay, still running on 100. Let us refresh. Yeah, still running on 100. That's why we don't hit the session timeout. Okay, we run it later on. It's fine. If you want to do the replica, you are able to do it here. So right now, I decided to create a replica for this DB. Click here, we create replica. Creating replica, again, it needs to create another server. So it will create the server, but it will say which server I would like to keep, whether my existing servers or I create new server. If I want to use existing server, is good. It's not an issue. Let's say you want to split the workload from read and write. You can have that. We already have it. I can show you later on. But I kept it in the same data center, same but different server. Same data center but different server. If you want to have it within the same data center, within the same server, just for the purpose of splitting the read and write operations, you can just click on the same server here as we have. Oh, sorry, we cannot. The name is the same. Then we need to create the same server, replica server. So it will be Azure SQL DB event replica. And we put it different data center, maybe US Central. Oh, it says that cannot access. Maybe Southeast Asia. Then we just choose the SQL admin, then Azure SQL event, same username and password key in. Click OK. Next, 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 and we create. Yep. So you see that. Let's go home. Go for Azure SQL event. We go for this resource. The compute has been changed. The standard S1 10 DTU. And once it's changed, it actually kills the connection. The connection is disconnected. Let's check here. It says the transport level error. So when you try to change it, you need to remember the application will be disconnected. If you are going to do the changes middle of batch processing or during the working hours, then it can hit this error and it might disturb the application workflow. Let's try again. We try to insert and let's monitor. Okay, still need to let it run first. And this guy is still deploying. Okay, once it's done, you can go back and check it out. see that we have two servers, same DB, two servers, primary, geo-replica. It's trying to do the seeding, then it try to replicate. It will take some time because it's different region. Here, another thing that I would like to discuss is the auditing. Auditing is for the security purpose. If you want to do the database audit, you want to make sure that all the activities within your database, let's say insert, delete, update, selecting the records is captured, then you are able to enable it. It's the same thing as C2. So once you enable, it will ask you where would you like to keep. Usually I keep in the log analytics. Then it asks which subscription we choose, then the log analytics we would like to have, then the default. And also we are able to choose storage as well. Then let me check the storage. I want to create new storage. Azure SQL DB events. Just the standard is good enough. Then we click OK. No questions. Okay, perfect. Then we click save. So whatever activity we are going to have in the workload, it will keep it. It will track it. It's like says that this user inserted this record, this user updated that record. That's the level of auditing. Ledger is, as I said, it will make sure that the data that we are, what I call it, have it inside the Azure SQL DB is using the cryptography technology to ensure and validate whether the data is updated through Tamper or is through the application, is that's the normal update, and whether the update is valid or not. Another one is the data masking. Data masking, you can set a rule, but right now we don't have much of the columns and what I call it, the tables. It doesn't appear there. So if you want to do the masking here, it actually shows what schema, what table, what column, and what's the masking. Say I just choose this. I click add. This is the masking. Then I add another masking. Date. Then the default add. You can go for customized data masking. This data masking is actually added in SQL 2016, if I don't mistaken. Then they also add the feature to the Azure SQL DB. Then we click save. If you want to allow the user to see unmasked data, then you need to grant the permission. But again, it's out of this session. We just want to learn about the Azure portal and what's the feature for. Here's the data discovery and classification, which it's able to scan. It will come out with the, the list that what schema, what table, what column, whether it's sensitive, what kind of information type it is. Is it like personal info, credit card info, and so on, is able to do identifying. Then from there, we are able to do the masking as well. Anyhow, we only have one single table. Another one is the defender, which is one of our, the objective. We want to enable that. Anyhow, this one is enabled at the subscription level. So whatever resources we create is actually enabled automatically. If you want to enable this, there's one button here will appear, enable defender. You click on that, then it will enable it for you and come up with all the recommendations. So let's look at the recommendations from Defender for this database server. Sorry, the resource type for SQL DB. Yeah, for the SQL DB, the recommendation is to enable encryption at rest. So it says that 3 out of 5 databases are unhealthy, means 2 are encrypted, 3 no. So I know that 2 is my production environment that's already done, and the other 3, they are not production, so we didn't enable it. But if we want to enable it, it's not an issue. We just click here, transparent data encryption, click on, and we go for server level encryption or database level. Again, it asks whether you want to have key by yourself or you want to purchase or you select the key. So usually we go by server level to make sure that everything is managed by Microsoft Azure. Another part for the performance tuning is this here, performance overview. This actually shows the workload, but right now we don't have much workload in this database. I'm gonna show you this part in the performance part in our own production database server. So just hold on that. Here is another feature, is the automatic tuning, which we are able to say that, okay, force the plan, you want to create index or drop the index, just go ahead, or you inherit from the server configuration, because right now we are in the DB. Now, let's go to the server itself. In the server, we have other options here. We have the Azure Active Directory, SQL pools, DTU quota, backups, failover group, import and export history, and so on, and the network. Now, I want to create an elastic pool. Let's say we decide that we want to create another 2 DB, but we would like to use the elastic pool. We just create and click on new elastic pool, click on naming, Azure SQL DB pool. The name is good. Configure the server. I'm gonna go for standard EDTU, let's say 50 and 100 GB. And once you click here, the databases here as well you have. Would you like to enroll the sales DB inside this elastic pool? Yes, if you want, just click here, select it, apply. Then you are able to do it. Then you click per database setting as well. You are able to set how many DTU you want to set for per database setting. Here we have all, then click apply. Then we go for next. This is the downtime. Then next, the tag and create. So it's going to create the elastic pool and put that sales DB inside the elastic pool. Let's go back to the resource and check it out. So this is right now is here. We have elastic pool as well. You can see the pool here. Number of DB is still 0 because still under provisioning and still need to move it here. So it takes some time. To proceed, the next one is the backups. Once you configure, you put everything here, you need to have the backup processing. Whatever DB that you have in your server is actually come out with this backup. It automatically takes the backup, but again, we can come out with the retention policy. When you click on retention policy and select on a DB, then you are able to configure the policies here. I want to say that here this DB doesn't need point in time restore for 7 days. I can have it for 3 days. And the differential backup frequency, I want it every 12 hours. And the long-term retention, the weekly LTR, I want to keep it for 4 weeks. The monthly, I want to keep it for 2 weeks. Sorry, 2 months. And the yearly, I want to keep it for 1 year. And which week backup would you like to keep for this? Then the week first. Sorry, week 52. Yep. So it's going to configure the backup policy. Perfect. Let us check the elastic pool. Wow, 1 DB is added because it's already moved. When we check the SQL DB, we still have 1 here. The pricing tier is elastic standard. You click here and you click here. We are in the elastic pool. We can see that how much DTU been utilized and what's the combination together. And the resource utilization as well, we can have it in detail per DB. Backups, and here import and export. When you click on import and export history, it doesn't show anything. So how are you able to import a database backup? First of all, you only can import database from here. And this import database is the backpack or deckpack files. You are not able to, what I call it, import a BAK file in the Azure SQL DB. That's very unfortunate. You are not able to. If you want the BAK, importing BAK to Azure SQL DB, you are not able to. You need to go for Azure SQL MI, manage instance. Then from there, you are able to restore the backpack. Unless if you want to restore, like here, for example, SQL DB, here. Let's say we go for the server itself. If you want to do a kind of restore, you need to come here for restoration. Let's say you click on the DB, then you are able to restore. So this restore basically is from the previous backups that has been taken. It's different. It needs to restore only that specific database. If you want to add DB, extra DB from your on-premise, you only can go for import here. Import option here. So once you click here, it will ask you, where's the BAK file that, no, sorry, not the BAK, the backpack file it's stored. Then you need to choose, but right now we don't have it at the moment. I need to look for a backpack. Perhaps I export one. I try to export this one, backpack file. Then I choose the storage. Maybe I choose this one. Create a container. Azure SQL DB event. Oh, okay. Azure SQL DB event. And I go for public. Click yes. Then this is it. Then we key in the password. And we click OK. So it's going to export it. If we click on the server and we go for the import export history, it shows that what is the progress for exporting. And here again is disconnected because it moved to the elastic pool. So any configuration changes like moving to elastic pool, creating replica, or for example, changing the compute power, it will cause the termination. Please take note on that. So while it's exporting, then later on we are going to import back. I'm going to show you the failover group. So failover group is at the DB server level. So we want to add a group. I want to create is a kind of clustering, and go for Azure DB event group. Then I choose my Azure SQL. Oh, sorry, I need to create new. Then Azure SQL DB group. Then the login, Azure SQL event, same password. This is basically new login, but for the demo, I just keep it the same password. And I want to choose the Canada Central, then select. And here is the read-write failover policy. Oh, okay, it says that cannot be in the same region. Then, okay, then go for East US. Let us see whether it's able to create. Okay, perfect. So the read-write failover policy is for read-only replica, whether we want to make it as automatic or we want to set it as manual. So, you know, it try to, you know, switch the read and write workload between the servers. So let's go for the automatic. The grace period, we just go for 1 hour. So it, you know, it shows the minimum latency and the failover. And here I'm going to choose this SQL DB here. It says that additional monthly cost is 498 Malaysian ringgit, which is about 110 USD. Okay, it seems like okay, we need to add on this elastic pool, Azure SQL, even SQL pool. Then we click on this server. Sorry, this one I need to choose Southeast Asia because we didn't have that. Then we go for DTU standard, perhaps then, okay. Then next setting, tags review, create. Yeah, I need to key in again Azure SQL DB group. This is replica, no. Then we need to recreate Azure SQL DB group, Azure SQL event, and the password, then the US. Okay. And we select, oh, it still says that. Okay, let's create first. Let's check. Yeah, the exporting, it takes quite some time, even though the DB is very small, it's about 40 MB, but it takes quite some time. Even importing as well. You will be surprised that 200 MB backup, it can take about 1 or 2 hours to restore. Just bear in mind. It's actually trying to create the resource. Let us go through the networking, which is the firewall. We already said that. The Microsoft Defender, we already gone through that. We just need to enable, then after that, view the recommendations. Then the transparent data encryption recommendations, which is more on the performance tuning and the automatic tuning at the server level. But here, as I said, I want to show you our production environment. We have this DB called Ai-DBA for our product. So we have it here. We have a dev environment and we have the performance overview. So when we click here, we can see all these charts, the top long running queries in the last 24 hours. Then we are able to see that what sort of resources been utilized. You can see that here. And see it based on the CPU, data IO, or the log IO. So what's the difference between data IO and log IO? Data IO is usually for the select statement. If you see that a lot of data IO means that the data file been retrieved a lot, means the data is not in the memory, so it needs to access. The log IO is more on writing the transaction. So if you have a lot of log IO and maybe perhaps you have some latency there, means your update, insert, and delete commands is running slower compared to select statement. Can click here. We see the long running queries. It actually identify the query, hash it, and come up with some ID. So each query, it has unique ID by itself. Then it shows number of executions. If you are a SQL admin, you will know that this one you can get it from the SQL DMB, but in the Azure portal, they just show it like graphical here. So once you click, it try to load the query. This is the query. And this is the what I call the workload, the graph. If you click on the recommendations, it shows that, okay, for that specific database, you have these recommendations. But what is the impact? Is very low. Would you like to automate it? If you click on automate and I click on force on, and I apply it, okay, then Azure will automatically create or drop the indexes. So it will create missing indexes or drop unused indexes. But sometimes, because Azure is looking at single query, it doesn't look at entire workload. Then you will realize that after a while, it creates a lot of indexes that might not be used, or drop the index that you are basically rely on the index for the month-end processing. Then suddenly drop it because it says that, oh, for the whole month you didn't use it, so it's not useful. Then it drops it automatically. That's why in our environment, basically, I keep it off all the time. We need to do the performance monitoring, what I call it, on the weekly basis or at least monthly basis to see how's the query performance. Here's the performance recommendations. Again, it goes to the indexes, mostly indexes, and the query insights. Then you can check the long running queries, same thing, which you are able to see the the resources and the queries here. Sorry, this is the queries and the resources here as well. It's the same thing basically. So do you guys have any questions so far? No. Okay, if no question, then perhaps we go back to the slide. If you are required any services related to SQL Server, Azure, Power BI, you may scan this QR code and fill up the form. Then our sales team and our technical team can reach to you guys. And the last thank you. Thanks for joining. And I hope it was informative session for you. And we are going to have another upcoming event in the next month. Thanks. Thank you, Guy.